At precisely 3 o'clock in the morning on March 10th, 1603, a scream pierced the silence of Richmond Palace. Not the cry of a servant or the wail of a mourner, but something far more unsettling, the sound of England's most powerful woman discovering that her body had finally begun its rebellion against her iron will. Lady Catherine Howard, the Queen's most trusted attendant, found Elizabeth collapsed in her private chapel, clutching a silver crucifix with such force that it had drawn blood from her palms. The sight was devastating. This woman, who had commanded the respect of kings and emperors, now lay crumpled on cold stone, her elaborate gown spread around her like the wings of a fallen angel. What the court physicians discovered that morning would remain a carefully guarded secret for decades. Elizabeth's body, subjected to nearly 70 years of relentless stress, political paranoia, and the physical demands of maintaining absolute power, was shutting down in ways that defied their primitive understanding of medicine. Her kidneys were failing. Her heart struggled with an irregular rhythm that seemed to mirror the chaos of her mind. And most troubling of all, she had begun experiencing what we might now recognize as severe psychological episodes. Dr. John Dee, the Queen's longtime advisor on matters both scientific and supernatural, had been summoned from his estate 3 days earlier. What he witnessed in those final weeks would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Elizabeth had begun speaking to people who were not there, holding lengthy conversations with her long-dead mother, Anne Boleyn, arguing passionately with Henry VIII about decisions made decades before her birth, and most unnervingly, conducting what appeared to be formal audiences with invisible foreign ambassadors. The political implications of the Queen's condition sent shockwaves through the carefully maintained facade of royal stability. Sir Robert Cecil, her principal secretary, found himself managing not just the affairs of state, but an elaborate deception designed to hide the truth of Elizabeth's mental and physical collapse from both domestic enemies and foreign powers who would undoubtedly exploit any sign of weakness. Throughout the palace, servants whispered of strange occurrences that seemed to accompany the Queen's decline. Doors that had remained locked for years would be found mysteriously open, leading to chambers that Elizabeth had ordered sealed after the death of her favorites. The royal kitchens reported that food prepared for the Queen would be found untouched, arranged in patterns that suggested she had been feeding invisible guests. Most disturbing of all, guards swore they could hear music emanating from the throne room during the darkest hours of night, the same melancholy tunes that had been played during the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, 16 years earlier. Elizabeth's relationship with food had become increasingly erratic in her final months. The woman who had once presided over elaborate banquets featuring dozens of courses now survived on little more than watered wine and small pieces of bread that she would chew slowly while staring at portraits of Robert Dudley. Her physicians, led by the increasingly desperate Dr. Roger Lopez, attempted every remedy known to Renaissance medicine: bloodletting, herbal concoctions, even experimental treatments involving ground pearls and powdered unicorn horn that cost the royal treasury enormous sums. The international situation added layers of complexity to an already impossible predicament. Philip III of Spain, successor to Elizabeth's longtime nemesis, Philip II, had been quietly mobilizing forces along the French coast, waiting for news of the English Queen's death to launch what many believed would be a final Catholic assault on Protestant England. French agents had infiltrated London with unprecedented boldness, paying enormous bribes to palace servants for any scrap of information about Elizabeth's condition. Meanwhile, in Edinburgh, James VI of Scotland maintained the delicate balance of appearing respectfully concerned about his presumed predecessor, while simultaneously preparing for a succession that everyone knew was inevitable, but none dared acknowledge openly. His correspondence with English nobles had intensified dramatically, with coded messages arriving daily at Holyrood Palace. James had even begun secretly rehearsing his coronation ceremony, working with advisors to craft a speech that would honor Elizabeth's memory while establishing his own legitimacy as her chosen successor. The economic implications of Elizabeth's impending death were equally staggering. London's merchants had begun hoarding goods, uncertain whether the new king would honor existing trade agreements. The pound sterling fluctuated wildly on European markets as rumors about the Queen's health spread faster than official denials could contain them. English privateers operating in Caribbean waters found themselves increasingly isolated, unsure whether their letters of marque would be honored by a Scottish king who might prefer diplomatic relations with Spain over profitable piracy. Within the palace walls, the elaborate machinery of Tudor court life continued to function even as its central figure deteriorated before everyone's eyes. Elizabeth insisted on maintaining her daily schedule of audiences, meetings with ministers, and formal meals. But these events had taken on a surreal quality that unnerved even the most experienced courtiers. She would address empty chairs as if foreign dignitaries were seated in them, sign documents that her secretaries would later discover contained nothing but illegible scrawls, and deliver speeches to assembled nobles about military campaigns that existed only in her increasingly fragmented memory. Lady Mary Scrope, one of Elizabeth's oldest friends and confidants, later wrote in her private diary that watching the Queen's decline was like witnessing the slow-motion collapse of a magnificent cathedral. Every day brought new evidence of structural failure. A forgotten name here, a confused date there, moments of lucidity that only highlighted the growing darkness surrounding them. Yet Elizabeth's core personality remained intact, her legendary temper flaring whenever anyone suggested she rest or delegate responsibilities to others. The question of succession had become an open secret that nobody dared discuss directly in the Queen's presence. Elizabeth had spent her entire reign masterfully avoiding any definitive statement about her heir, using the uncertainty as a diplomatic weapon that kept potential rivals guessing and foreign powers cautious. Now, as death approached, that same ambiguity threatened to plunge England into civil war. Catholic factions still hoped for a restoration under a continental prince, while Protestant hardliners feared that James's relatively moderate religious policies might open the door to papist influence. Archbishop John Whitgift, one of the few people Elizabeth still trusted completely, spent hours at her bedside, attempting to provide spiritual comfort to a woman whose relationship with God had always been complicated by political necessity. Elizabeth's faith, shaped by the tumultuous religious upheavals of her youth, had evolved into something intensely personal yet deliberately ambiguous. She had burned heretics and protected Catholics, defended Protestant doctrine, while maintaining diplomatic relations with the Pope's representatives, always prioritizing England's interests over theological consistency. The physical transformation of the Queen during her final weeks was perhaps the most shocking aspect of her decline. The elaborate makeup and costumes that had created the iconic image of the Virgin Queen were gradually abandoned as maintaining the illusion became impossible. Servants who had known Elizabeth for decades were startled by glimpses of her natural appearance: pale skin marked by illness, thinning hair that revealed the scalp beneath, hands that shook uncontrollably when she thought nobody was watching. French Ambassador André Hurault de Maze, who had somehow managed to secure a final audience with the dying Queen, later described the encounter in terms that bordered on the supernatural. Elizabeth, he wrote, appeared to be inhabiting multiple time periods simultaneously, speaking about current events as if they were ancient history, while referencing long-dead political figures as if they had recently left the room. Most unsettling of all, she seemed to be conducting negotiations for her own funeral arrangements with invisible intermediaries, discussing details with the same meticulous attention she had once devoted to treaty negotiations. The practical challenges of managing Elizabeth's final days fell largely to Thomas Cecil, son of her former Chief Minister William Cecil, who found himself coordinating between the Queen's increasingly irrational demands and the urgent needs of a government preparing for transition. Elizabeth insisted on reviewing military reports about threats that no longer existed, demanded updates on the construction of fortifications that had been completed years earlier, and flew into rages when courtiers could not produce officials she wanted to consult who had been dead for over a decade. As March progressed, even Elizabeth's most loyal supporters began to acknowledge that the situation had become unsustainable. The woman who had once controlled every aspect of English political life through careful manipulation and strategic ambiguity now represented the greatest threat to the stability she had spent 45 years creating. Her refusal to formally name an heir or delegate authority meant that essential decisions were being postponed indefinitely while the machinery of government slowly ground to a halt. The international community watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and opportunistic calculation. The Venetian ambassador wrote detailed reports describing Elizabeth's condition for the benefit of merchants who needed to adjust their trading strategies. Dutch representatives quietly negotiated with James's envoys about maintaining the military alliance that had proven so profitable for both nations. Even the Ottoman Empire, England's unlikely ally against Catholic Spain, sent discreet inquiries about whether existing agreements would survive the transition to a new monarch. Elizabeth's final public appearance occurred on March 20th, when she insisted on presiding over a ceremony honoring English sailors who had recently returned from a trading expedition to the East Indies. Contemporary accounts describe a ghostly figure who bore little resemblance to the vibrant monarch of popular imagination. Propped up by cushions and supported by loyal attendants, Elizabeth managed to deliver a brief speech praising English maritime courage. But witnesses noted that she seemed to be addressing people who were not present while ignoring those who actually stood before her. The medical community of the time was completely overwhelmed by the complexity of Elizabeth's condition. Renaissance physicians had no understanding of the psychological factors that contribute to physical decline, nor did they possess effective treatments for the various ailments that were simultaneously attacking the Queen's body. Dr. Lopez and his colleagues resorted to increasingly desperate measures, including experimental bloodletting procedures and treatments involving exotic substances imported at enormous expense from distant corners of the known world. Religious leaders across Europe prepared for the aftermath of Elizabeth's death with varying degrees of anticipation and anxiety. Catholic priests in Rome had already begun planning Thanksgiving services for the end of what they considered a heretical reign, while Protestant ministers in Geneva worried about the future of their English supporters under a Scottish king whose religious convictions remained somewhat mysterious. The complex web of international religious politics that Elizabeth had navigated so skillfully for decades threatened to unravel completely in the power vacuum her death would create. The servants and lesser courtiers who witnessed Elizabeth's final days carried memories that would influence English folklore for generations. Stories circulated about supernatural occurrences surrounding the dying queen, lights that appeared in empty rooms she had once occupied, the sound of invisible footsteps in corridors she no longer walked, and most persistently, reports of a woman's voice singing ancient lullabies in chambers that had been empty for hours. On the evening of March 23rd, Elizabeth made what would prove to be her final, coherent statement to the small group of officials assembled around her bedside. Looking directly at Sir Robert Cecil, she spoke with startling clarity about her fears for England's future under foreign rule, her regrets about the personal sacrifices required by royal duty, and most poignantly, her hope that history would judge her actions in the context of the impossible choices she had faced throughout her reign. The actual moment of Elizabeth's death, which occurred in the early hours of March 24th, was witnessed by fewer than a dozen people, all of whom had sworn solemn oaths to maintain absolute secrecy about the specific details. What is known is that her final breath came not with struggle or drama, but with a kind of peaceful exhaustion, as if she had finally allowed herself to rest after a lifetime of relentless vigilance. Lady Catherine Howard later described those final moments in a secret letter to her sister, writing that Elizabeth's last words were not the formal statement recorded in official histories, but something far more personal and heartbreaking. As the Queen's breathing grew shallow, she had whispered repeatedly about a dream in which she was dancing with Robert Dudley in a sunlit garden, free from the weight of crowns and the burden of decisions that had defined every moment of her adult life. Dr. John Dee, present in those final hours, documented strange phenomena that he would later attribute to what he called the displacement of royal essence. The temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably at the moment of Elizabeth's death, candles flickered despite the absence of any wind, and most unnervingly, several witnesses reported hearing what sounded like distant music emanating from rooms that had been empty for hours. These accounts would fuel rumors about Elizabeth's spirit that persisted for decades throughout English folklore. Within minutes of Elizabeth's death, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events began to unfold throughout England and beyond. Pre-positioned messengers rode toward Scotland with news for James, while other riders carried word to major English cities where local officials would need to maintain order during the transition. The elaborate system of communication that Elizabeth had developed to control information about her reign was now employed to manage the news of her death. Sir Robert Cecil had prepared for this moment for months, creating detailed contingency plans that accounted for everything from potential Catholic uprisings to foreign invasion attempts that might exploit the succession crisis. Teams of trusted officials were dispatched to secure key ports, arsenals, and treasury locations, while others worked to ensure that news of the Queen's death reached loyal supporters before it could be exploited by potential enemies. The international ramifications of Elizabeth's death began to manifest within hours. In Madrid, King Philip III received the news through an elaborate network of spies and immediately convened his council to discuss whether this might represent an opportunity to reclaim English territories that Spain had lost during the previous reign. French officials, equally well informed through their own intelligence networks, began calculating whether a Scottish king on the English throne might alter the delicate balance of power that had kept continental Europe relatively stable for decades. The immediate aftermath of the Queen's passing revealed the extent to which England's political stability had depended on the force of a single extraordinary personality. James's accession proceeded smoothly in formal terms, but the subtle changes in court culture, diplomatic relationships, and popular sentiment would continue to unfold for years. Palace servants noticed that the very atmosphere of royal residences seemed different without Elizabeth's presence. Corridors that had once hummed with nervous energy now felt hollow and purposeless. The economic consequences of the transition became apparent within days rather than months. Merchants who had developed personal relationships with Elizabeth's trade commissioners found themselves uncertain about the continuity of existing agreements. The wool trade, which formed the backbone of English prosperity, experienced immediate fluctuations as continental buyers questioned whether Scottish control might alter quality standards or pricing structures that had remained stable for decades. London's population, which had grown accustomed to Elizabeth's regular public appearances and carefully choreographed interactions with ordinary citizens, struggled to adapt to James's more reserved Scottish approach to monarchy. The new king's preference for governing through written proclamations rather than theatrical public displays left many feeling disconnected from royal authority in ways that would have profound implications for the development of English political culture. Religious communities throughout England faced particular uncertainty during the transition period. Elizabeth's carefully balanced approach to religious tolerance, which had allowed various Protestant denominations to coexist while maintaining restrictions on Catholic practice, might not survive under a king whose theological views remained somewhat mysterious to his new English subjects. Parish priests found themselves fielding anxious questions from parishioners worried about potential changes to liturgical practices, while Catholic families wondered whether the new reign might bring either increased persecution or unexpected opportunities for restoration. The transformation of court life under James revealed just how thoroughly Elizabeth's personality had shaped every aspect of royal culture. The elaborate rituals of dress, speech, and ceremony that had evolved around her specific preferences and political needs suddenly seemed obsolete. Courtiers who had spent decades mastering the intricate protocols required to navigate Elizabeth's court found themselves adrift in an environment governed by entirely different expectations and social dynamics. Foreign ambassadors stationed in London during the transition period provided detailed accounts of the changing political atmosphere that offer fascinating insights into the broader implications of Elizabeth's death. The Venetian representative wrote extensively about the subtle shifts in conversation topics, the altered patterns of alliance formation among English nobles, and the gradual emergence of new power centers that had been suppressed or hidden during the previous reign. Perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth's death marked the end of an era in which the English monarchy had successfully balanced competing religious, political, and economic interests through the sheer force of individual charisma and strategic brilliance. James inherited a kingdom that was prosperous, stable, and internationally respected, but he also inherited the impossible task of maintaining that success using very different skills and facing very different challenges than those that had defined his predecessor's reign. The legend of Elizabeth began to take shape even before her body was cold, as supporters and critics alike began crafting narratives that would serve their own political purposes in the new reign. Catholics emphasized her alleged cruelty and religious persecution, while Protestants praised her defense of English independence against foreign Catholic threats. Neither version captured the full complexity of a woman who had navigated impossible circumstances with a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and theatrical genius that would never be replicated. The age of Elizabeth was over, and with it ended not just a dynasty, but an entire approach to monarchy that had depended on theatrical genius, calculated mystery, and the sheer force of individual will. England would prosper under James and his successors, but it would never again be ruled by anyone quite like the extraordinary woman who had transformed a small, threatened island kingdom into a major European power through 4 decades of political mastery that came at enormous personal cost.